Okay, boys and girls, we're at the first paragraph on page 141. I stood at the window watching. Mother told me to get away from the window and go about my work, but I didn't. I stayed there. Finally, about a half hour later, the officers mounted their horses and began riding through the troops, shouting orders. Within a couple of minutes, the soldiers were formed up in the training ground, ready to march. And just as they were about to start off, there came the sound of horse galloping. I dashed outside in time to see a horseman come over the rise of the road from the direction of Danbury. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, and I guessed that he was a rebel messenger. Suddenly he spotted the British troops formed up in the training ground. He reined up and wheeled the horse around. Bending low, he kicked his heels into the horse and started to tear off back the way he had come. There was a commotion in the British ranks and a quick fusillade of shots. Fusillade. Everyone, what is it? A bunch of shots of fire at the same time. Excellent. The man suddenly straightened up in the saddle and flung his arms out. His head jerked backwards, and he slid off the back of the horse, and he lay still in the dusty road. A British officer shouted, and the troops marched out. The rider's horse was cantering off in a field, bucking. The troops marched past the body. None of them turned to look at him. Finally, the last of the wagons disappeared around the bend, and I started running down the road toward the body, scared of what I might see. Other people came running up too. The man was lying on his stomach with his face turned sideways. There was a tear in his shirt in the center of his back, and blood was soaking through the cloth. But sweat was running off his pale face, and he was breathing hard. "Pick him up and carry him to the tavern," Mr. Reed said. "Meeker, go up to Dr. Hobart's house and tell him we've got a wounded man here." It was over 2 miles up to Dr. Hobart's. For a moment, I thought about saddling up a horse, but the British troops were marching ahead of me in the direction of Dr. Hobart's, and I was afraid that if I came galloping by on a horse, they'd take me for a messenger and shoot me too. On foot, I could cut through the fields if I had to. I began running. Within 5 minutes, I ran into a dusty haze kicked up by the troops. I realized that they must be just ahead of me. I jumped to the side of the road, swung over the stone wall, and cut across the pasture to the next stone wall, which was bordered by a line of trees. I slid over this wall, and I began running along it, parallel to the road. I figured out I would run past the British troops and come out ahead of them before they reached Dr. Hobart's house. It would take some running, though. The British column was a mile long. I ran, stumbling through the pasture stubble and furrows and the plowed fields, and I had covered almost 2 miles when I heard shots. At first, only 1 or 2, but then a fusillade. I dropped flat behind the stone wall, and then I raised my head to stare around. I couldn't see anything but the empty field that lay between me and the road. I slid over the stone wall, and I began to run, crouched over toward the stone wall at the other side of the field which bordered the road. When I got to the wall, I flung myself flat and listened. The shooting was going on down the road away. I took a chance, and I raised my head to look over the wall. The British column was disappearing around the bend, but a couple of dozen troops had stayed behind. They were kneeling on the road in a line, firing at Captain Stewart's house across the road from them, on the other side from where I lay. From where I was hidden behind the stone wall, I could look through the downstairs window in the side of the house. There were rebels in there, firing back at the redcoats. The way I figured it, the rebels had hidden there and had begun shooting at the British troops, and they marched by. Through the windows, I could see the rebels moving around. I could recognize all of them, but I couldn't recognize all of them, but I knew some. One was Captain Starr. Another was Samuel Smith's Negro slave, Ned, the same one who had first come running to report the British troops were coming. As I watched, one of the British pitched flat on the road. The rest went firing into the building as if the bullets coming out at them didn't matter. It was the way the British fought. Suddenly an officer shouted an order. The British troops rose, their bayonets flashing at the ends of their muskets. The officer raised his sword and charged toward the house. The troops ran after him. When they reached the door, the officer stood aside while the soldiers battered the door with their muskets. Suddenly it crashed open and the troops charged in. I heard somebody shout, "There are the darned blacks in here! What shall we do with them?" "Kill them!" the officer shouted. He charged through the door waving a sword. I could see Ned swivel away from the window where he had crouched, attempting to swing his rifle around to get a shot at the officer. But the officer was quicker. He slid his sword into Ned's stomach. TJ.
I'm sorry.
And then jerked it free. Ned staggered around, still raising his gun for the shot. The sword flashed in a bright arc at the fastest thing I'd ever saw move. Ned's head jumped off his body and popped into the air. I never saw it fall. The drop down behind the stone wall. I dropped down behind the stone wall and I vomited all over myself. And then I got up and I ran across the field and I fell over the other stone wall. As I lay there smelling my vomit and seeing Ned's head jump into the air. It was a long time before I realized that I was soaked with cold sweat and crying. I knelt up and I listened. The shooting had stopped. I remembered the man in the tavern. He was dying too, and I didn't want to have his death laid on me. I slipped along the hedgerow, and when I was well past Star's house, I came up the field back into the road, and for a moment I looked. In the distance, I could see the British troops milling around the house. They were carrying heavy objects into the house. I knew what they were, but I didn't want to think about it. When the British had all the things in the house, they set fire on the house. I turned and I ran down the road toward Dr. Hobart's. I didn't feel much like being a Tory anymore.
No. Wait, I thought